We'll make sure we wait till 2:30 so we pick up anybody else that comes in who at the right time. But we'll start getting ready here. Maybe I've got a couple of announcements to handle for the Historical Society. If you're a member of the Historical Society and you haven't renewed your membership for 2011, or if you're somebody who isn't a member who would just dying to become a member, our treasurer is over here in the corner, and Cindy will sign you up, and she's happy to take your dues. Straight to your bank. Excuse me, how much are dues?
$5 for individuals and $15 for a family.
Yep, it's a bargain.
Those are 1890s prices.
That's right, 1890s prices. It allows you to come to our programs that are open to the public. So I guess you get what you pay for. I also wanted to mention in a probably a, I don't know, we'll say a disconnect, but very different than our program today, is that we have two programs scheduled for later in the year. One I'm doing and one Scott Sanders is doing, and they're both going to revolve around the Civil War. So we'll start with the Peaceable program, and then we'll move into the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, because of this year being the 150th anniversary. We're going to do a program on the beginnings of the Civil War and how it affected small towns like Yellow Springs. And then Scott's going to do what I think ought to be a really interesting program on Antioch College and the Civil War. So we'll have that. It is pretty close to 2:30, so I would like to introduce our speaker, John Fitzgerald. He's come all the way from Leesburg, Ohio, where he's the pastor of the Leesburg Friends meeting, and he's written a book which I hope he's got some copies here to show and make available if you'd like to purchase a copy, on the Peaceable Pilgrimage, if I said that right, Peaceable Pilgrimage, which is the story of the Quaker migration in the early 1800s into southwest Ohio, and particularly into Highland County, where Leesburg is. He can tell us exactly where Leesburg is, for those of us who don't know. But I think because of the Quaker influence in this area as well, it'll be something that we all ought to find interesting. And so without any further word, if you'd like to, I apologize for the no podium. I feel awkward if I don't have someplace to turn over to you, John, but we'd love to hear your talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, David, for the kind introduction today. And very glad to be here. It's a wonderful day, isn't it? Wow. Thank you for spending your time inside. You could be outside, and hopefully it will be worth your while to spend some time together. This is a beautiful center. Really impressed with Yellow Springs Senior Citizen Center. And glad to meet each one of you a little bit. Hopefully, if I haven't, we can meet after the program and chit-chat a little bit. But especially glad to welcome my dear friend Jane Brown. Jane is a great listener. If you ever have something you want to talk with, talk to Jane. My wife is a talker, but she says I'm not a listener. So my wife, Carolyn Fitzgerald, is also here. So Carolyn often shares in a program with me, and we make it informal. Invite your questions and comments along the line. It is a very informal program. But I have written a book. 2002 is when it came into publication, so it's 9 years old now. And I'd like for you to take a look at the book as we talk. I'll use it as a guide, plus I have a study sheet. You can keep the study sheets. You can keep the book for a price. If not, please turn it in at the end of the program. So, Carolyn, could you help me pass these? And then we'll pass the books out. You're welcome to take a copy. I'd be glad to autograph a copy at the end of the program. Welcome. I've given the talk probably 50, 60, 70 times by now, so it covers most of the same base points, so my most entertaining time now is the questions and answers, because I've given it enough that I get kind of tired of giving it sometimes. But I could also fit in where David mentioned in the introduction about where Leesburg, Ohio, where we live is. It is in Howling County, where Hillsborough is the county seat. We're about 10 miles south of Hillsborough. Or if you know where Wilmington is, we're about 20 miles from Wilmington. It's about 45 miles from here, 50 miles at the most. A little bit over, maybe an hour drive or so. A little over an hour drive, I'd say. That's where it's at. It's a little village about the size of Yellow Springs, maybe a little smaller than Yellow Springs.
Not too far from the Great Serpent Mound.
Pretty good. Actually, Serpent Mound's probably about 40 miles from us. It's in Adams County, Serpent Mound. We're in Harlan County. So, are you all where you can see a sheet? We'll start with the sheet and begin with that. Since you are a historical society, I've printed up a little reference work. Let's turn where it says reference sources for Quaker genealogy work. And this is just some basic information if you're interested in doing research on Quakers in general. The standard work is Encyclopedia of American Genealogy, which is a 5-volume set written by William Wade Pinshaw. If you're interested in looking up ancestors who are Quakers, that is really the place to turn. They're expensive individually, or you can buy the whole set, but a lot of libraries have them. Are any of you doing that kind of work? Were you familiar with this volume? Okay, you never bought this. Pretty good work, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Some of it's online.
Some of it's online.
Mm-hmm. Some of it's over at Zenit at the Green Room.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. So if you're interested in doing that kind of work, that's the place to begin. Also, Wilmington, I mentioned Wilmington, there is this college here, Wilmington College, which has Quaker connections, is Quaker College. And they have all the records of Friends here. Friends have been very good about keeping records. Very detailed work for a religious group. So you can find, for instance, Leesburg Friends, where I pastor, has records way back to the early 1800s. That's a place to look up records locally for Friends.
Can you tell a little bit about the history of Wilmington, how the Quaker started?
The college?
Yeah.
I'm not real accurate, but I think it's probably late 1800s it started. I can't give you a specific year, but
After the Civil War.
after the Civil War. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's after the Civil War.
Yeah, the land that sits on was my great-great-grandfather's farm. And so maybe closer to 1870.
Yeah, that sounds about right. So, I think originally it was started by another religious group, and then the Quakers bought them out, is the way I remember it. But it's been Quaker since about 130, 140 years. Then, of course, this last one that I wrote down is just for us very locally. There's a person in our community who's done a lot of Quaker work, so that one pertained to you particularly. Maybe this isn't on the sheet, but since we have representatives, members, tenders from Yellow Springs Friends meetings here, like most religious groups, there are different groups of Quakers or Friends. The group that Carolyn and I belong to has its headquarters in Richmond, Indiana, just across the Ohio-Indiana border. It's probably about 75, 80 miles from here. My guess is the Yellow Springs Friends probably connected to Philadelphia group. Is that correct?
Praise General Friends.
Friends General Conference they call it, which is headquartered in Philadelphia. Then there's a more, just kind of speaking in general, the Friends General Conference, which Yellow Springs is part of, is traditional in Quaker worship in that they don't have any pastors. Folks are led by the Spirit of God out to speak out of worship, and ministry is done out of that sense. I function pretty much like a traditional Protestant pastor. I'd be very comfortable in a Methodist church. You know, I preach a sermon. I'm awfully tired. I preached a sermon today. Then we have a choir. My wife is the choir director. And we have Sunday school. I tend to visit people in the hospital when they're sick, attend committee meetings, that sort of thing. Pretty much like any other Protestant clergy is the way I work. And our grouping of friends is pretty much like a mainline Protestant church. We wouldn't be too much different than, say, Lutheran or Episcopalian or American Baptist kind of congregation.
Do you have sacraments that you practice?
We do not have sacraments. Outward, we have the traditional quiet time, probably about 10 minutes, 15 minutes at the most. People are encouraged to speak out of that. Some people say that's better than the sermon. I don't know why they would say that. But I always say, what? The best part of the service is the sermon. Don't you know that? No. Yes, we have quiet time. There is a group of friends in Ohio that are very evangelical. They're called the Evangelical Friends. They're based in northern Ohio, around Canton. There's a Quaker college there. It used to be called Malone College. I think they changed the name of it recently.
It's still Malone College.
Is it still called Malone? I thought they had changed the name, but maybe not. It's an evangelical friends would be not too much different than a Baptist church. They have outward sacraments, a lot of them, and they're very evangelical in terms of their theology. But I mean, Christ takes a primary role. Not to say that we're not Christian or anything, but you know, we're like most mainline churches. Christ and God and the Holy Spirit are all sort of mixed together. And then the Yellow Springs friends, Christ, you know, sort of there in the distance somewhere. That's theologically, if you're looking at it, is the way the friends kind of divide themselves. Also, in terms of their faith expressions, the friends. Now, I'm speaking for Yellow Spring friends. I shouldn't do that. But if you're here, if people from Yellow Springs want to speak about their own perspective, my perspective of the Yellow Spring Friends group is their expression of faith will be more liberal than ours. They will be very, very active in the peace movement, expressions of God's peace, whereas we sort of mention it but don't do much about it. And then the evangelical friends would be pretty much opposed to it, the peace movement. So you sort of had that breakdown within our little group of Quakers, of friends. So that sort of gives you a background of how our little group, our little religious tradition is, which it goes on to this next section that I wrote about. Who are the Quakers? Quaker is a nickname given to us. Our official title is the Religious Society of Friends. Our traditional roots, if you look at that historically, 1650 is a common starting date for the Friends movement. It is an English tradition, which is different than the German or continental. That's why one thing that separates us from the Amish, a lot of people confuse Quakers with the Amish, but one major difference is they have a German background, we have an English background. I mean, still today, the Amish speak a form of German in their language when they communicate with each other, whereas we're, you know, I have trouble with English, let alone German. So. We are part of the Protestant Reformation movement, which swept over the European continent during the 300-year period, 1400 to 1700. Friends came to America soon after the beginning in England and have been here ever since. 3 of the 13 original colonies in America had really strong Friends influence. Of course, the primary one being Pennsylvania, which is a Quaker colony founded by William Penn. I always say that William Penn founded the biggest pencil in the world, Pennsylvania. And New Jersey has some strong Quaker roots, and Rhode Island, the 3. Friends are also have been always very strong in North Carolina. They are still strong today. There's a lot of Quakers down in North Carolina. So, you know, about a third of the American colonies, Quakers were pretty active in the beginning. As I mentioned, we are part of the Christian church, which is important distinction to make, although even within our own religious tradition, sometimes we argue about that. You know, I think most religious groups do exactly what you mean by Christian, and whether or not you're a Christian or not, what that means for you. So, depending on what Quaker you would ask, what kind of response you'd get to that question. But most people, both inside Quakerdom and outside Quakerdom, would consider us a strong part of the Christian movement. And some of our distinctive teachings are about peacemaking. Anybody who knows anything about Quakers usually associates them with peacemaking. The anti-slavery movement or abolition movement in the 1800s in the country, in our country. Underground Railroad in particular, Friends. Somebody was talking here about one of the Friends meetings around here was a stop on the Underground Railroad. That seems to be pretty traditional. Everywhere you go, the Quakers are supposed to have some kind of connection to the Underground Railroad. Equality in that right from the beginning, women and men were equal, and we had women ministers right from the beginning in the 1600s, which is very unusual. I mean, for the 1600s to have women being ministers was very different. And equality and silence, where it's not the silence, but it's silence as a means to getting close to God, where you're listening to the voice of God is what we instruct. Some people just think, well, you're quiet. Well, no, that's not really the idea. The idea is that you're quiet, you make yourself quiet so that you can hear God's voice. That's the theory behind it anyway, which is a pretty good concept. And then, as I mentioned, Quakers are not Shakers or Amish, because a lot of times people, say that we are like the Shakers or the Amish. And I go into a little bit of detail in one of the chapters about the Shakers in particular. The Shakers, one of the things about the Shakers is they were started by a Quaker lady, which it's easy to see why people confuse us with the Shakers. I don't know if you want to look at that right now or wait a minute, but I've forgotten her name. What was it? We have to look. Mother Ann Lee. We can look that up sometime if you want to. Okay, that covers that page. Kind of the general background. If you're doing genealogy, if you're interested in who we Quakers are, I gave you a little bit of background, some of the common misconceptions about Quakers, and some of the common beliefs we have. Now the other side is kind of just a very thumbnail sketch of what the book is about that I wrote. There's 4 chapters, but I want to go to the things you're interested in. Most of the groups I talk to, I spend the whole time just talking about Quakers. We can do that, or we could talk more about the historic material in my book, which is, some of it's kind of Quakerish, but some of it's just kind of a general history. I don't know. Do you want to hear more about Quakers? Let me ask that. Are there more Quaker questions or things about Quakers?
What's your relationship with Quakers and the Native Americans?
I have a whole chapter on that. Did I pay you to ask that question? Chapter 3, that's another thing Quakers are known for that sets themselves from being different than most of the religious groups in that most of the religious groups did not have a real strong dynamic relationship with the Native Americans or the Indians. The Quakers did, and my third chapter, I write quite a bit. I write in general about some of the major figures, Native American figures of this period, Little Turtle and Tecumseh and Blue Jacket, some of the well-known stories, and then I put specifically some of the Quaker things. There's a little school in northern Ohio that Friends ran that ministered to some of the Indians. And then in our area, I wrote some of the journals between the Quakers who came to the area and mixed with the Shawnee Indians. Some really interesting stories. So we could get to those stories if you'd like to hear more of those. Is that
Why don't you give one example?
one example of a story? Carol always, you want to tell the story, Carol? Or do you want me to tell it? She's better at telling stories than I am. But, let's see. The founder of the Quakers in Leesburg had a son. Son went to bear hunting on a beautiful day like this. Had a friend who was a Shawnee Indian living in the same area. Of course, they couldn't communicate. One spoke English and the other spoke Shawnee, but they could kind of gesture. And so they were out bear hunting, and the dogs they had, one of the dogs was being attacked and mauled by this bear. So the Quaker guy shot the bear, but it didn't kill it. The bear was still mauling this dog that they had, and so the Shawnee Indian pointed to the Quaker guy and went like this, the chopping motion with his hand, meaning that he was to go in and kill the bear with his tomahawk. And the Quaker guy stopped and thought about a minute, and he went like this to the Indian. No, you go back. You go and kill the bear with your tomahawk. So finally they stood there and they were talking about it and kind of communicating about it, and finally the Quaker guy went in with his tomahawk and finished off the bear. And both the Indians and the Quakers enjoyed some bear meat. That's one of the stories I put in.
Was your family among the pioneers that came? Mine were, and my husband's were cousins. Was your group that came up from King Creek and
No,
Piney Woods?
I don't have strong Quaker roots. My family doesn't. Cane Creek sounds like it's from Carolina. Is that where you're from?
My family came from Carolina. So
Yeah.
they're here. They come to Warren County, and they end up settling around Sligo and Wilmington and Harveysburg.
Yeah.
And they're coming 1789, 90, and then the rest of the families move up. As things start to really heat up in the Carolinas about the slavery, then they start picking up their families and moving up here.
Yeah.
So how did you choose to write about the families that came up here, since you don't have a Quaker background, that wasn't your family?
My starting point was we're trying to restore old Friends Meeting House, historical Friends Meeting House, the oldest one in our area. It's built in 1822. In fact, there's a picture at the end of the book. Page 88 in your book is what it looks like, called the Fairfield Meeting House. So originally I began work thinking, well, how could I get people interested in restoring this old building? Most people think it's just an old barn. You waste your money trying to restore that thing. So how could I make it come alive as it would be a vital place for them? And that's the approach I took. As I started writing and thinking about, I thought, well, you know, if I write some history stuff that only applied to just a few old Quakers, I'd sell maybe 100 books, so something like that. If I took that same information and set it within the general historical framework of the time, then I'd appeal to a much wider group. And that's exactly what has happened. I've been able to speak to a lot of groups because put it in within the context of what was going on in America and in Southern Ohio in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and wrote it from that standpoint. So I've spoken to actually a lot more non-Quaker groups than Quaker groups. Since you raised the question of how the Quakers got here, that's the story of chapter 1. We'll look at that briefly. If you're studying how your ancestors got here, my general advice is, one, study the Indian pathways, because invariably, logically, they would follow the pathways that were already built. And there was a major Indian pathway into southwest Ohio. It's called the Pickawillany Trail. It's Shawnee Trail, and it's described for you in your book, the first chapter. Do you remember what page that's on, Carol? Like I said, I tried to put this within the general context of events. A lot of people don't know that Daniel Boone was born into a Quaker family. His home is pictured on page 15. I put a lot of things I just thought were interesting, and hopefully other people would think it was interesting. Page 19 is where the Pickawillany Trail started off in present-day Portsmouth, went north and west towards Piqua, Ohio. That's where it ended up. And that would be one major thoroughfare that the early settlers took getting here. Of course, when the white settlers started flooding into this area, they built two major paths. One is called the Zane Trace, which is also pictured on page 19, and the other would be the National Road. The Zane Trace was started by a Quaker, Ebenezer Zane. I've got his genealogy there, talked about in 19 and 20. He petitioned Congress, said that he could build a quicker road, better road from Wheeling to Fort Washington, which is Cincinnati. Wheeling, West Virginia. He founded the town of Wheeling, West Virginia, which is on the Ohio River right across the border from Ohio. And he shaved 300 miles off the usual route from Philadelphia to Wheeling. So Congress accepted this plan and they built the Zane Trace Highway. Still, markers are still there today if you go out east. You can see it. And the National Road pretty much follows routes, state routes, or Interstate 70 today. And a lot of the cities in America, in the Midwest, are built on the National Road. So those were the two major pioneer pathways once the settlers flooded into Ohio. The other thing I would say is follow the waterways, because water was the primary modes of transportation. The Quakers who came to Leesburg, they followed the established waterways, and this is not true just for Quakers, but no matter what your religious background, they would have followed the waterways. The Quakers who came to Leesburg crossed the Ohio River from Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, built some flatboats, sailed down the Ohio River to present-day Portsmouth, where the Scioto River intersects the Ohio, came up north to Chillicothe, and followed the Paint Creek watershed to present-day Leesburg. And that's pretty typical of most pioneer migration patterns. They followed the major rivers, followed the creek, and settled on the creeks. So if you're looking to see where your ancestors landed, if you have deep roots in this country, then that's how they did it. Page 17 gives you a map of all the early Quaker meetings. I'd say 2/3 of these meetings are gone by now, but this is how it looked originally, 1801 to 1820s, when most of them were established. Leesburg, where I pastor, is typical of that. They were started in 1802.
That's 18. It's Fairfield.
Fairfield.
So were most of the Quakers coming into this area were coming from the south then, rather than from Pennsylvania?
That's almost invariably true. People in southern Ohio, hardly any of them came from the north. If you think about it, Cleveland, everybody from there came from New England and those places. Southern Ohio, it's almost Kentucky, Virginia. I bet you if I were to talk to your ancestors, if you said you had ancestors settling southern Ohio, almost 100% of them, they would come from Kentucky or Virginia.
No, and then Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania, maybe.
I'm a Harlan, and part of mine went to down around Cane Creek and into North Carolina and Guilford County. And then part of them stay in Chester, Pennsylvania, because they were given land by Penn. And then as they progress into their beliefs about the slavery, and they start to pool their money to come up here, the ones from the south came up first, and then the ones from Pennsylvania are coming about 1809 to maybe 1815. And
Right.
stay here, and then they go to Indiana and Illinois.
Right. Yes.
Were people given land, was it in the, it was my understanding that the government was interested in developing the North.
That's the story of chapter 2. You guys are amazing.
Okay,
Sims
well,
Purchase?
I wanted,
I was thinking about the Virginia Military District, which I have a whole chapter pretty much on. Have you heard of the Virginia Military District? Page 4, just to get back to this, people coming to south. These are Quaker trails in Ohio. There's a map there. You can see that almost all of them come from Carolina, like our friend here says, Virginia. You have to remember that West Virginia was part of Virginia at this point. West Virginia was not separated till after the Civil War. West Virginia was the state of Virginia up to the Civil War. So Virginia, Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky. What do you think about it? The way Ohio is situated today, Cleveland, that area very much has a northern flavor to it. Cincinnati, the south, very much has a southern flavor to it because of the roots and where the people came from. Very different mind state between Cincinnati and Cleveland. And it's all because of the historic roots, where people came from and their mindsets were coming into those territories. So, page 34. What's on page 34? Yes, that's pretty. What I talked about is a lot of the material in chapter 1. This moves into chapter 2. Carolyn and my wife's talking about Virginia Military District. Are you ready to hear that story? Go for it. Back right after the Revolutionary War, trying to form a government for the new country, and to have a country survive, you have to have a strong federal central government. And in the beginning, this was not at all sure it was going to be made possible, because the 13 original colonies were all competing over who was going to be in predominance. So you had Virginia, Connecticut, and Carolina all making huge land claims. For instance, the state of Virginia made a claim that all the land from east to west would be part of the state of Virginia, beyond the mountains, beyond the Appalachian Mountains. And you had all the 13 colonies making similar land claims that this land that the settlers now were pouring into west of the Appalachian Mountains would all become part of their states, and it would just stretch invariably onto the Pacific Ocean. Well, if you're going to do that, then you would have no strong central government. All the states would just, rule the new nation. So Congress early on made a compromise saying that the colonies would give up their land claims beyond the Appalachian Mountains. In exchange, they would give land for the veterans from that colony who had fought during the American Revolutionary War. And that was the compromise they made. And so for our purposes here, the Virginia Military District is land that was set aside as part of this compromise where Virginia relinquished its land claims beyond the Appalachian Mountains and exchanged it. Their veterans who had served during the Revolutionary War would be given bunches of land
So
in
how
exchange
did
for
that,
the service.
how did that coordinate with the Quakers moving into the southwest part of Ohio and the Mennonites moving into the northeast, since both tended not to want to participate in military operations?
Well, one thing is the Quakers were very much interested coming to the free soil of Ohio, because it was a non-slave state, coming into the new country through the Northwest Ordinance. I suspect the Mennonites too. I don't know enough about their history, but one thing would have been the fact that it was non-slave, and the second thing, which Quakers are still interested in today, it was cheap.
Well, I can see that the Quakers would be interested in it, but if the land was being held in reserve for veterans, how did
Because
they?
not all veterans claimed their land.
Exactly.
And they sold off
Okay.
their claims. So if you didn't want to move, you could sell your pension that you got.
That's very much part of the story. In fact, most cases, the Virginia military veterans were getting older by this point. They had families. Their wives didn't want to come to the howling wilderness of Ohio. Ohio was a wasteland. Why would you want to come to Ohio with a family? They wanted to stay, they wanted Indian country. They wanted to stay where it was settled, civilized. So what emerged is a system where the veterans could sell their land claims, get a cash settlement for selling to a middleman, and the middleman would in turn sell it to the pioneers who really wanted to come here. And that's why in early Ohio history, the middle people in the middle of the system turned out to become very wealthy. They were all land surveyors or land speculators. If you think, I write about all this in the second chapter, by the way. It's a pretty fascinating story about American history. People like Thomas Worthington, who was a Quaker, the father of Ohio statehood. He was a land speculator, land agent. Nathaniel Massey, Duncan MacArthur. I don't know. Let's see. I write about a lot of this. Nathaniel Massey's picture's on page 36. He was the surveyor of the Virginia Military District. It was like a huge parcel of land. I wrote down to figure out exactly how large it was. But anyway, page 34 is the graphic of how large today the Virginia Military District is. You can see it covers a wide area. That was what Washington had. Oh, 4 million acres is what it says on page 34. 4 million acres of land he surveyed. No wonder he was wealthy. If you can imagine that. I suspect what they would do, of course, is surveying it, knowing where the choice pieces of land, they would reserve a little bit here, a little bit there for themselves, sell off the poorest acres, and make quite a bit of money on the side, which a land agent would do the same thing. And so in early Ohio history, these are the people who really benefited were the people who were in this middle part, were buying off benefits from the veterans and then just selling to the pioneers who wanted it. the
Where were
land.
the records being kept?
Well, all these Ohio is just becoming a state, and these counties are just emerging, so they're kept in the newly emerging county courthouses. I mean, Highland County where you live is just, and I assume Greene County where we are today, they were part of the system as it was emerging, because this is all brand new. It's just like today. I mean, the people who are making the money, the people who figured out technology, somebody in the computer business, they're making great money. We figured out something new. Anytime a new system emerges, the people who figure it out are going to make boo-hoos of money. That's what happened in early Ohio history. So, where are we at? Yes.
What was that phrase you used?
I-
Losing money?
That's just a new. Do you like that phrase?
I just want to make sure I understood what it meant. But it looks like that, from the map, the small map in your book, Greene County was right at the top of that.
Right.
Virginia
Greene
military.
County is part of the Virginia Military
Okay,
District.
good.
In the beginning, Greene County ran all the way to the Great Lakes.
Oh,
Okay.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's
Yeah.
over the years, then it's split all up.
Highland County was really large too. I mean, like I said, the counties were part of the system. They just broke them up and drew boundary lines as more population flooded into them.
And they settled land disputes.
Right.
And as the Indians were forced out and they gave up their land, then more counties were developed.
The pretty good system for everybody but the Indians, who of course forced the land off the land, which I read about in the 3rd chapter. I think a friend here mentioned about the Indians, that's really the dark side of American history. The Indians really were treated shabbily by all of us. Even the Quakers weren't the greatest, but we did better than some.
As I understand this, that there was some, the meetings were slow to grant monthly meeting status from outside of Ohio because they wanted to know that people, that the Friends came by their land before taking it from the Indians. That's one reason why meetings didn't occur as quickly as they might have. So
Probably so, yeah.
Friends generally did take great care to make sure that they purchased the land from the
Right.
arrangement.
Right. They tried to be conscientious about it anyway. The Quakers, where we live, pretty typical of the pattern. They came up, they saw good land, and they waited till they could raise some money, and then they bartered for it. You know, they gave some cattle and grain and stuff for the land to Nathaniel Massey, Duncan MacArthur, who were the wealthy landowners at the time. And they purchased a whole bunch of land at once. Because they were not in an individual. One thing about Quakers is they always came in community. Oftentimes you read in, like, a whole Friends meeting would come from North Carolina up. Because they did that, they could wait and bind together as families and buy pretty major pieces of land for everybody to come at once. Because, you know, they had the group power and then families were all buying. And there was 3 Quaker families that came and purchased all the land in Leesburg originally. But 3 families then were much larger. You know, they had lots of children. So you're probably talking about 30 people just in the 3 families. So they waited till they had enough land to support 30 people before they bought anything, which is a lot different concept of the land today. You know, today you got 2 people or even 1 people, you're going to buy some land.
And they're agrarian, so you have to have a huge family in order to do that kind of lifestyle.
Right.
Just like the Amish do today. You can't farm the way they farm without a lot of family help.
Right. And as I said earlier, follow the creeks. They settled on Lee's Creek, which is where Leesburg is. And that's a pretty typical pattern. They almost always settled on a creek. But that's not unique to Quakers. Most pioneer groups did that. What else do we?
Do you still have pioneer families in your congregation?
Yeah, Carolyn's family and some others. They go way back to the beginning. Beginning for us is 1802. That's another reason I wrote this book. 2002 is when it came out, so it was the bicentennial of the founding of Leesburg. We had a big party. I sold a lot of books. No, it was really a nice celebration.
You mentioned that some of the earlier Quaker meetings discontinued.
Yes.
Are there historical records of these?
Yes, they're all in Wilmington College for the most part. All the ones that we call them being laid down.
And the primary reason for their disappearance was?
Well, part of it is Quakers followed the migration patterns. They went out west. There's a lot of Quakers in
So
Iowa.
they depopulated.
Some of them depopulated. Some of them lost interest. And the Quakers got smaller as a religious tradition. We're very few today. So I would say those would be the two primary reasons. Either moving or people just lost interest.
In our area, the Quaker meetings are all so close together. Like, there's 5 or so real close to Leesburg. So as transportation improved and people could go places more easily, then they did. So those meetings just died out.
So part of it that held together was dependence on sport?
Well, when Quakers started to become more part of the world, they lost some of their internal sense of community. I mean, the Amish still have a very strong sense of internal community, but they're not strongly related to the outside world. Friends used to be that way. That's why we are confused, the Amish, because Quakers were pretty much set apart from the world, you might say. But when Friends became modern, it lost some of the inner continuity and reasons for being a Quaker. I mean, why not be just a Methodist if you're going to be like the world?
Don't pick on her. Don't pick on her, she says.
Oh, don't pick on you? I just say that because the Methodist Church is right down the corner from us.
But I found when I talked with my cousins that some of them are still Quaker. They love going to the Methodist church.
Yeah, there's a lot of similarities between the Methodist and the Quaker. Of course, we are much more godly.
That could be true.
What is
Holier than them.
What is the relationship between the Quaker community in Costa Rica and locally here?
The Friends in Yellow Springs could answer that better than I. Do you know much about Costa Rica, Friends from Yellow Springs?
I don't think there's a direct connection, that strong a connection between the Costa Rica and Monteverde Friends and here. It was a group from a number of places that went down and formed a community down there. Some of them, I don't think that there was any one meeting that was tightly connected.
Were they from Ohio?
Some, but some from probably Pennsylvania, from a number of places. So it was people, it was a group that got together. My daughter went to school with a girl at Earlham that had grown up in Monteverde. But I think the other thing, Dan, in part of the answer to your question, one of the meetings that's shown on this map in the northeast corner of Greene County is actually, I think it's in Clark County, is Green Plain. So I think the county line was different then. It's in Clark County now. It's Green Plain, and my grandparents were part of that meeting. And essentially it died, was laid down because the people who had originally in the meeting were farmers, and later on people moved to the cities and became part of meetings in other places, including Yellow Springs. So instead of traveling to Green Plain, there was the meeting that grew up here in Yellow Springs, or
was developed in Yellow Springs, not part of the original Quaker movement into Ohio.
Yes,
I heard this phrase twice, I think it's a Quaker, it's called laid down.
yes.
Could you expand that a little bit? My sense of laid down is when I'm tired, I lay down.
It just means that you're shutting the doors for worship, that no longer functioning congregation. That's just the term we use.
Well, it's also used for not just for meetings, but someone's been taking on a concern for some cause, and then there's a point at which that cause is either fulfilled or there's some other reason why you lay down that cause. So it's to say that you're no longer active in whatever that was. So that could be the meeting, or it could be a cause, or it could be anything that gets laid down. Like you lay it down, it's at rest, it's no longer active.
Yeah,
It's like
that's
you going
a
to
helpful
bed.
point.
Pardon me?
It is like you going to bed.
Yeah, it is when I get tired, I lay down, or go to bed.
Yes,
You distinguish the Amish and the Quakers. I've heard a term, German Baptist.
yeah.
Is that in that same realm? Distinguishable?
Well, a German Baptist, they probably would, not for certain, but I would think they would have some Amish roots to them. And there's all kinds of overlaps between Brethren and Amish and even Baptists, although you don't think of Amish and Baptist necessarily being together, but there are some overlaps. There's all kinds of little splinter groups.
The Hutterites.
Hutterites. Yeah. And they're just like I described earlier, that some are among Quakers. There's some very conservative Quakers, there's very liberal Quakers, there's some very conservative Mennonite, Amish groups. We have a lot of Mennonites around us, Amish, and they're worse than us. They have hundreds of little splinter groups. Various forms of old order or new order, and what that means in terms of how you can express yourself, and whether you dress modernly, whether you use a car. In general, the Mennonites are more modern, the Amish are not necessarily so, just depending what kind of group you're, just like Quakers. And we're like Quakers, we Quakers sometimes talk to the other Quakers, and the other Amish don't talk to the other Amish. This is the way it is. Depending on what your variety of faith is.
This is not connected to Quakers, but if you ever want to go and you want to learn more about the Mennonites, the Huttites, and the Amish, Old Baptists, Old Amish, Berlin, Ohio, which is in Holmes County, is this diorama. It's 140 feet wide. It's called, and it's a museum type thing. It's called Behold, and it's the whole history of all the Anabaptist movements, which is what the Amish, which is adult baptism, I believe. You join the church as an adult, not as an infant. And it's really fascinating. And, well, plus Holmes County is pretty beautiful to go to. So, and also they also were Swiss as much as they were German.
Right.
Calvinistic.
Right.
But our family, like, I'm a Harlan, Hadley Hale, Carter, Farlow, and our families come from Ireland. And then when the Irish and the British argue, they go to Great Britain and then come into the country when William Penn starts passing out land in order to have a place where nobody would bother them, no matter how they chose to worship.
Right.
Yeah.
Another question?
Yeah.
Yes, Dave.
Could you just explain the organizational levels, the monthly meetings, the quarterly meetings, the yearly meetings, how that works?
Yeah, the Quakers have never been really good at organization. But kind of a loose organization or structure is the monthly meeting is the local level, and the quarterly meeting is like a regional, and then yearly meeting is like the district or state level. And then the yearly meetings would be affiliated with some of the more major groups, like I explained in the beginning, Friends General Conference, would be a major grouping, which is mainly the Friends that don't have pastors. Our group is called Friends United Meeting, which is kind of like a mainline Protestant group. And then there's the Evangelical Friends, who have a center up in Canton, Ohio, which is pretty evangelical in faith, more like a Baptist group, you might say.
I'd actually like to take issue with one thing you said, is that I think it's an amazing organizational structure, because it's one of the few that's a bottom-up structure instead of a top-down structure. So if you're thinking of structure as being an authoritarian top-down, it's a very poor structure. But if you want an example of a structure that's a powerful bottom-up structure, it's one of the few around that is a good bottom-up structure.
Yeah, although I'm thinking, being in church work, there's a lot of churches that would claim the same kind of structure. The Church of Christ would say that they have no top-heavy denominational.
I'm not saying it's the only one, I'm saying it's a good model.
Right.
Rather than being a poor organizational structure, it's a good model of a bottom-up structure, and there's others as well.
Right, it's a good model for individual participation, because we don't have the problems of a bishop or somebody telling us how to do things.
And so from that standpoint, the ultimate authority is in the individual's relationship to God.
Right.
And then there's the monthly meeting in which you test your individual relationship with the community of the meeting, and the meeting will make decisions as a meeting, and then representatives of that meeting will go to quarterly meeting, and decisions will get made by those representatives, and then that'll go to yearly meeting. And the yearly meeting is actually the highest level of organizational structure, so the national organization is more of a service entity and not part of the actual decision-making aspect.
So when you talk about a monthly meeting, though, is that one location? It just,
Right.
okay, it's not multiple
Yes, no.
churches.
Yes, no. Because there is a system of preparative meetings, and there are a few places where there may be 2, 3, 4 preparative meetings. Join once a month for monthly meeting for business. So, yeah, we took care of that too.
So it's mostly when you refer to a monthly meeting, it's a business meeting rather than
A monthly business meeting is what
Okay,
its
okay,
name
okay,
from.
okay.
Do you own your facilities as a congregation? Because
Right.
Methodism's, the district owns
Right.
everything.
Right. No, the local congregations own it.
And you choose your own pastor if you have a
Right.
pastor, if you have a programmed meeting.
Right.
Yeah. That would be nice.
Supposedly that's the way it works.
Someone asked about where records are kept, besides the local, which is at Wilmington, Swarthmore College, and Guilford College in North Carolina all have Quaker
Yeah.
records.
There's a lot of small Friends colleges, wherever the closest Friends college you choose would be the place to look for your records.
Erlen.
New Hampshire has-
Erlen has a lot of
Turn
records.
over their minutes.
Some,
Some
right.
individual meetings don't turn over their minutes to, we have some like that in our yearly meeting. They've never turned their minutes over to the college. They still have them at their meeting
Mhm.
house.
Right. Yes, Friend
I was going to say Haverford has it.
Haverford, right.
You have to dig a little.
Take a little bit.
Hit the pavement for these things.
Yes,
You mentioned that most of the Quakers came up from the south,
Right.
with an English heritage. I think of Cincinnati that they would have had a likely go-through as being strong German heritage.
But we didn't stay there.
yeah.
We didn't stay there, we just rode through.
Yeah, there's not a, go ahead. Might explain why there's not a strong presence in Cincinnati of Quakers. We're mostly in rural areas like Leesburg. Usually the furthest away you are from the city, that's where you'll find Quakers. Out in the hitherlands.
You know, a lot of those people, just like my family, when they came up, Cincinnati was not a healthy place to live. They, that's why a lot of them came to Yellow Springs in the summertime to get away from Cincinnati because of malaria and other diseases in Cincinnati. They came to Yellow Springs for the cure and to stay up here over the summertime. So when they're coming up, And the land around Waynesville, Harveysburg, over where you are in Highland County, Clinton County, it's much better farming land, and it's hilly, but it's nothing like what Cincinnati was. Because early Cincinnati, they're trying to grow grapes up those hills down there, and you can see how successful that turned out to be. So, your families did the right thing. They moved up into areas where they could buy larger parcels of land.
Well, I've been at it about an hour. Do you want to, we're getting tired of this? Or there's a little bit more I could say about the last chapter, or we can just quit. Whatever you want to do.
Go for it.
Go for it, eh? Do you have any more questions before I move on to chapter 4?
We had a question about getting along with the Native Americans. I think all the meetings in our area have some kind of a story where the original settlers did something to try to get along with the Native Americans when they moved into that area. We have several little stories about that, about how they made peace agreements and they visited back and forth. And matter of fact, in Leesburg, there's one story about a lady she was the minister of the Fairfield meeting, and she got on her horse because some of the men weren't attending Quaker meeting on Sunday. They were going out and visiting the Indians, so she got on her horse and went out and got all of them and brought them back to church. So there's a lot of stories like that.
That was considered the founding of the meeting, isn't it?
And John, we do need to keep a little time afterwards, so if people want to buy a copy of the book, they'll have a chance to.
I'll say just a few minutes about the last chapter, and then we'll call it a meeting. The last chapter is about other religious faith other than Quakers who are active in the area. And I talked some about the Church of Christ and the Cane Ridge Revival down in Paris, Kentucky, not too far from here, and the Campbellite religious tradition. The Shakers built a large settlement in Lebanon, not too far from here. That's on page 81. And the Presbyterians, primarily in the form of John Rankin, who founded an anti-slavery movement in Ripley, Ohio, on the Ohio River. And he was active in some of the stories of Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harry Beecher Stoll, page 84. I'll just close with one story about the Methodist. Oh, we have a Methodist. Page 78, Peter Cartwright. Peter Cartwright really active in the primary story in American history, not just our local history, because he's a representative of the circuit riding Methodist preacher who was so influential building up the Methodist Church. The Methodists became the Methodists and the Baptists became the two primary religious Protestant traditions in America after the Revolutionary War, because one, the Methodist circuit riding preacher reaching out to lonely populations on the American frontier, and two, the American Baptist farmer preacher model. The farmer, preacher, Baptist, and still today, of course, the Baptists and the Methodists are the two largest American Protestant religious traditions today in terms of population. So Peter Cartwright was very important for American history and religion in America, because he was right at the forefront of this movement, and I wrote several pages about him. He's fascinating to me because he started out as a young man at 20 years old, was ordained a Methodist clergy, grew up in Kentucky, was converted to Christ at 16, followed the population northward from Kentucky up into Ohio, and traveled the Methodist circuit in southern Ohio for a year or two, starting at age 20. Soon afterwards, he went westward with the settlers, American settlers, and spent most of his career in ministry in Illinois. While preaching and being a Methodist circuit riding preacher, became active in the politics of the day. Of course, in the early 1800s, the burning issue was slavery, whether you were for or against it. And Cartwright took the stance that Quakers did. He was anti-slavery. And he became active in politics and ran for political office while in Illinois. And ran for a seat in Congress under the Whig Party platform. And his congressional opponent in the election cycle happened to be a young man named Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was running for office first time at this time. And since Cartwright was a Methodist preacher, religion would necessarily be one of the topics of conversation during their political discourse. And one of the few occasions that we have Lincoln stating anything about his religion is during this campaign. A lot of times you see people take these little excerpts that Lincoln has written about religion. Well, it's from this campaign against Cartwright. Cartwright kind of forced him into saying something about religion. What happened is Cartwright quickly fell behind in the campaign. And if you read on page 79, I talk about this. He printed a handbill saying that Lincoln was an infidel, which is in other words saying he was a heathen, no good communist or something like that. Yeah, and Lincoln was forced to retort to that campaign smirch, and Lincoln said, although it is true, I am not a member of any Christian church. My position is held by several of the Christian denominations. I could never support a man for office whom I knew to be an open enemy or scoffer of religion. Then I said Lincoln need not have worried. He won the election over Peter Cartwright overwhelmingly and served a term in Congress. Turned out Peter Cartwright was a better minister than politician. So to me, the whole story is fascinating that here you have this young guy, 20 years old, Peter Cartwright, active on the American frontier here in Ohio, travels westward, settles in Illinois, and runs against Congress, against Lincoln. In their congressional campaign, a lot of the remarks that Lincoln had to make about religion are taken from that campaign. So I wrote about that. It really doesn't have too much to do with Ohio, but I just put a lot of stuff I was interested in the book. So I think I'll leave it at that unless you have some more questions. It's been a lovely day. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.